The morning of August 6, 1945, begins like every other morning in Hiroshima. A paperboy turns a corner. His sandals slap wet stone. Somewhere above the rooftops, a crow calls once and then goes quiet. The air is warm, already thick with summer, and the city smells the way it always does at this hour. Charcoal smoke, river water, and the particular sweetness of wood that has absorbed years of living. Hiroshima is not a famous city. It is not Tokyo. It is not Kyoto. It is a place where people go to work, where children go to school, where rice is eaten at wooden tables and the news is folded carefully and set beside a teacup. It is, on this particular morning, indistinguishable from 10,000 other mornings. A girl named Setsuko, 12 years old, is braiding her hair in front of a small mirror. She ties the end with a piece of red string. Her mother calls from the next room. Something about breakfast, something about being late. Across the city, a tram creaks along its tracks. A factory worker clocks in. A teacher writes the date on a chalkboard, August 6, 1945. A dog trots across an empty bridge. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall stands at the bend of the river, its copper dome turning slowly green in the heat of another ordinary summer. There are roughly 350,000 people in Hiroshima this morning. None of them know what is coming. At 7:09 a.m., an air raid alarm sounds across the city. People look up, shield their eyes. In the distance, barely visible, 3 American B-29 bombers cross the sky at high altitude. The city's anti-aircraft defenses track them but do not fire. These reconnaissance flights have been happening for weeks. By now, residents have grown accustomed to them. The all-clear sounds at 7:31 a.m. People return to their breakfast tables. Trams resume. The paperboy finishes his route. One of those 3 planes was not a reconnaissance aircraft. At 8:09 a.m., a single B-29 breaks from a clear blue sky directly above the city. It is flying at roughly 31,000 feet. No one on the ground pays it much attention. It is alone, high, silent to the ear. A few people glance upward. A few do not. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, something small falls from its belly. It takes 43 seconds to reach the altitude at which it has been designed to detonate. For those 43 seconds, Hiroshima is still Hiroshima. Children are still in classrooms. The tram is still running. Setsuko's red string is still in her hair. Then, to understand what happened on that morning, and 3 days later, over the city of Nagasaki, you have to go back. You have to understand the sequence of decisions, discoveries, and desperate calculations that brought the world to this singular, irreversible moment. Because the bomb that fell on Hiroshima did not emerge from nowhere. It was built, deliberately, by thousands of human hands, at the direction of human minds that believed, some with conviction, some with doubt, and some with anguish, that it had to be done. This is the story of how the world changed forever. And it begins not in Japan, but in a physics laboratory in Berlin, in the autumn of 1938. On December 17, 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann conducted an experiment that would, in retrospect, feel less like science and more like the opening of a door that could never be closed. Working in their Berlin laboratory, they bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons. What they observed, confirmed weeks later by physicist Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch, was nuclear fission, the splitting of an atom. In the process, an extraordinary amount of energy was released. The mathematics were clean and terrifying. If a chain reaction could be sustained, if you could split enough atoms in rapid succession, the energy released would not be measured in pounds of TNT, but in thousands of tons. The year was 1938. Adolf Hitler had just annexed Austria. Europe was accelerating toward war. And scientists on both sides of the Atlantic understood immediately what the discovery of nuclear fission might mean in the hands of a government at war. Several of those scientists were refugees from Nazi Germany. They had fled persecution. They knew precisely what Hitler was capable of, and they could not stop asking themselves the same question that would haunt physicists for the next decade. What if Germany builds it first? In August of 1939, Albert Einstein, who had himself fled Germany, signed his name to a letter addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter, drafted largely by physicist Leo Szilard, warned that recent research into uranium had led to the possibility of setting up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, which could be used to construct extremely powerful bombs. The letter urged Roosevelt to establish contact with the physicists working in this field. It urged the United States government to act. Einstein would later call the signing of that letter the one great mistake of his life. Roosevelt read the letter. He passed it to an aide. He said simply, "This requires action." What followed was the most ambitious, most secretive, most morally contested scientific program in the history of human civilization. They called it the Manhattan Project. It began modestly. A small committee, a modest budget, a handful of physicists gathered at Columbia University. But as the war expanded, as Pearl Harbor brought the United States into direct conflict in December 1941, the program accelerated. It grew into something vast and unprecedented. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 people. It operated across dozens of sites scattered across the United States and Canada. Most of those 130,000 people did not know what they were building. They did not know the ultimate purpose of the machines they operated, the materials they refined, the calculations they ran in the middle of the night. Compartmentalization was absolute. Secrecy was enforced with the kind of intensity that wartime generates, the kind of intensity that makes ordinary people keep extraordinary secrets for years without asking why. But a small number of people knew exactly what was being built. His name was Julius Robert Oppenheimer, and he was going to change the world, whether he wanted to or not. Oppenheimer was 38 years old when he was appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project's weapons laboratory in 1942. He was slight, intense, given to quoting Sanskrit poetry in moments of stress. He smoked incessantly. He wore a pork pie hat. He was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of his generation, and he had the rare additional gift of being able to hold together teams of equally brilliant, equally difficult personalities and direct them toward a single goal. His colleagues remembered him in contradictory terms: generous and ruthless, visionary and cold, capable of both extraordinary warmth and a cutting precision that could silence a room. He had also, in the years before the war, moved in left-wing political circles. He had friends who were communists. His former fiancée was a communist. His wife had been married to a communist. In another era, these associations would have been irrelevant to his ability to calculate neutron cross-sections. In the era of wartime America, they made him a man perpetually under surveillance, perpetually suspected, perpetually required to prove his loyalty. He was brilliant enough and necessary enough that the government tolerated the contradiction. But they watched him. Always, they watched him. In the summer of 1942, Oppenheimer and Army General Leslie Groves, the man appointed to administer the Manhattan Project, selected a site for the Central Weapons Laboratory. They chose Los Alamos, a remote mesa in New Mexico, accessible only by a single winding road. The site was deliberately isolated. Scientists and their families were brought there under conditions that resembled, in some ways, a voluntary imprisonment. Mail was censored. Travel was restricted. Children born at Los Alamos were registered with the county as having been born at P.O. Box 1663, because the town's actual location could not be officially acknowledged. Here, in this strange, isolated community of brilliant minds perched above the New Mexico desert, the bomb was built. The scientific problems were enormous. Fission, the physicists knew, could be achieved. But to build a weapon, To release enough energy in a fraction of a second to destroy a city required solving problems that had never been confronted before. The bomb required either enriched uranium or plutonium, both of which had to be produced in quantities that, at the time, seemed almost fantastical. Entire cities, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, were constructed essentially from nothing for the sole purpose of producing these materials. Tens of thousands of workers ran machines that separated uranium isotopes or produced plutonium in nuclear reactors, without knowing that the material they were processing would eventually be dropped on human beings. The scientists at Los Alamos debated two bomb designs. The first was a gun-type device, a relatively straightforward mechanism in which one piece of highly enriched uranium was fired into another to achieve supercriticality. They were confident enough in this design that they would never test it. The second was an implosion device using plutonium, a far more complex mechanism in which conventional explosives would compress a sphere of plutonium inward so rapidly that a chain reaction would be triggered. This design was untested, theoretical, and deeply uncertain. Which is why, at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in southern New Mexico, a name that translates, with grim appropriateness, as Journey of the Dead Man, they set one off. The Trinity Test. The first nuclear detonation in human history. The explosion released energy equivalent to roughly 21 kilotons of TNT. It turned the desert sand beneath it to glass. The shockwave knocked observers off their feet at a distance of miles. The mushroom cloud reached a height of 7 miles in under a minute. Oppenheimer, watching from behind darkened glass in a concrete bunker, later recalled that a phrase from the Hindu text the Bhagavad Gita came to him. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Whether he said it aloud at that moment or recalled it later in reflection, the sentiment was not wrong. They had done it. The bomb worked. And already, the question of what to do with it had moved into the hands of a new president. Franklin Roosevelt had died on April 12, 1945, of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. He had been president for 12 years. He had led the United States through the Depression and through most of the Second World War. He had also, for 3 years, concealed from his own vice president the existence of the Manhattan Project. Harry S. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. He had met with Roosevelt fewer than a handful of times. He knew almost nothing about the atomic bomb until the evening of April 12, 1945. The same evening he was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States, when Secretary of War Henry Stimson pulled him aside after a cabinet meeting and told him, briefly, that there existed a project of immense destructive capability. The full briefing came 12 days later. What was Truman thinking in those weeks? The question matters enormously, because the decision that would kill more than 200,000 people, a conservative estimate, was ultimately his. He was a Missouri politician, a former haberdasher, a man whose formal education had ended at high school, who had educated himself through decades of reading history. He was blunt, practical, and not given to philosophical anguish in the way that Oppenheimer was. His diaries from this period are remarkably frank. He called the bomb the most terrible thing ever discovered. He wrote that he hoped it could be used in a way that kept civilian casualties to a minimum. But he was also a president at war, inheriting a conflict that had already killed tens of millions, that was consuming American soldiers at a rate that staggered the imagination, and that showed no clear path to ending without a land invasion of the Japanese home islands, an invasion that military planners estimated could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and potentially millions of Japanese lives. The war in the Pacific had been unlike anything the European theater had produced. It had been characterized, on both sides, by a ferocity that bordered on the absolute. The island-hopping campaign, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, had produced casualty rates that shocked American commanders even after years of combat. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed and more than 19,000 wounded in 36 days of fighting on an island 5 miles long. At Okinawa, the last major island battle before a potential invasion of Japan itself, nearly 14,000 Americans were killed, more than 72,000 wounded, and Japanese military and civilian deaths numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Japan's military leadership, though they knew by the summer of 1945 that the war was lost, knew it in the precise mathematical sense that their supply lines were cut, their navy was destroyed, their air force depleted, and their cities were being firebombed into rubble, refused to consider unconditional surrender. The code of Bushido, the concept of dying with honor over living with defeat, had been so thoroughly inscribed into the Japanese military culture that even faction leaders who privately wished for peace felt unable to advocate for it openly without risking assassination or disgrace. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 and 10, 1945, a single night of incendiary bombing by hundreds of B-29s, had killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. It was one of the deadliest air raids in human history. And Japan had not surrendered. Truman was advised by military planners that Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan, could cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would be vastly higher. There were discussions, in the summer of 1945, about the production of enough Purple Heart medals to cover anticipated American casualties through the invasion. Many of those medals, produced in 1945, are still being awarded to American soldiers today. The backlog was that large. Against this backdrop, the question was not, for Truman, for Stimson, for the military leadership, whether to use the bomb. The question was when, and where, and how to deploy a weapon of unprecedented destructive power in a way that would shock Japan's leadership into unconditional surrender without requiring the invasion that would, by any estimate, be catastrophic. Not everyone agreed with this calculus. A petition signed by 70 of the 150 scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, including Leo Szilard, who had done more than anyone to initiate the program, urged Truman not to use the bomb on cities without first issuing an ultimatum and demonstrating the weapon on an uninhabited area. Some advocated for a demonstration blast on an uninhabited island, visible to Japanese observers, as a warning. Oppenheimer, along with James Fermi, Ernest Lawrence, and Arthur Compton, the four-man interim committee panel of scientists, advised against the demonstration. Their reasoning was bleak but logical. There were only 2 bombs ready. If the demonstration failed to shock Japan into surrender, the psychological impact would be reduced and the element of surprise destroyed. And they could not guarantee the bomb would work perfectly under demonstration conditions. The petition reached the Secretary of War's office. It was classified and filed without reaching Truman. The decision was made. The target list was prepared. Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata were selected as primary and alternate targets, cities with strategic value that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing so that the effect of the new weapon could be accurately assessed. The men who selected these targets included factors such as urban area greater than 3 miles in diameter, important targets in built-up urban areas, and ability to cause significant blast damage. Hiroshima was selected as the primary target. It was home to a major military headquarters. And it was, in the cold language of targeting committees, a suitable size. On the evening of August 5, 1945, on the island of Tinian in the Pacific, a flat, coral island that the United States had captured from Japan just 1 year earlier and converted into the largest bomber base in the world, a B-29 superfortress named the Enola Gay was loaded with its payload. The weapon it carried had a name. The scientists at Los Alamos called it Little Boy. It was a gun-type uranium bomb, 10 feet long, 28 inches in diameter, and weighing approximately 9,700 pounds. It had never been tested. The scientists were confident enough in its design that a test had been deemed unnecessary. The crew of the Enola Gay were told they were carrying a weapon of unusual destructive power. Not all of them knew it was atomic. Some would not learn the full nature of what they carried until after the bomb had been dropped. The plane was piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had named the aircraft after his mother. He was 30 years old. He was skilled, calm, and experienced. He had been selected for this mission months earlier, had trained his crew for it with meticulous care, and had been given extraordinary authority to abort if conditions were not right. The Enola Gay took off from Tinian at 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945. The flight to Hiroshima would take 6 hours. At 7:09 a.m., 3 weather reconnaissance planes arrived over the target cities, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki. Their reports were relayed to the Enola Gay. Hiroshima was clear. Visibility was good. The mission would proceed. Back in Hiroshima, the air raid alarm had sounded and cleared. People were going about their mourning. A group of students from the first Hiroshima Prefectural Girls' High School were working at an outdoor site, clearing buildings to create fire breaks. Soldiers were doing calisthenics in a field. A surgeon at the Red Cross Hospital was beginning his rounds. At 8:09 a.m., the Enola Gay arrived over Hiroshima. Tibbets handed control of the aircraft to his bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee. Through his bomb sight, Farabee identified the aiming point, the Aioi Bridge, a T-shaped bridge that crossed the Ota River near the center of the city. He had been trained to drop the bomb within a few hundred feet of a designated target. He would miss the Aioi Bridge by only 800 feet. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the bomb bay doors opened. Little boy fell. 4:43 seconds, it fell in silence, the city rising up to meet it. The Enola Gay banked hard, a 155-degree turn executed with urgent precision to put maximum distance between the plane and the blast. The crew put on dark goggles. Tibbets gripped the controls. No one spoke. At an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the city, the altitude at which the weapon was designed to maximize blast radius, Little Boy detonated. The temperature at the hypocenter, the point directly beneath the explosion, reached several thousand degrees in the first fraction of a second. Human beings within a half-mile of the hypocenter were vaporized. Not killed. Not wounded. Vaporized. Some left shadows on the pavement where they had stood. Dark outlines burned into stone by the thermal pulse that preceded, at the speed of light, everything else that was coming. Those shadows are the only evidence that they were ever there. The blast wave followed the thermal pulse by a fraction of a second. It moved outward from the hypocenter at the speed of sound, shattering every structure within a mile. Buildings that had survived years of conventional bombing were reduced to rubble in an instant. The pressure change was so extreme that lungs collapsed, eardrums ruptured, internal organs were torn from their moorings. The tram that had been running its route stopped forever. The paperboy who had finished his route did not survive the morning. Fires ignited across the entire area simultaneously, not spreading as in a conventional bombing raid, but simply appearing everywhere at once, as the thermal pulse ignited every combustible surface it reached. Within an hour, these individual fires merged into a firestorm. The firestorm created its own wind, pulling superheated air inward from the surrounding area, feeding itself, consuming what was left. Of the 90,000 buildings in Hiroshima, roughly 62,000 were destroyed. Of the city's 33 hospitals, 27 were rendered inoperable. Of the 298 doctors practicing in Hiroshima that morning, 270 were killed or wounded. Of the 1,780 nurses, 1,654 were killed or wounded. The city's capacity to treat the wounded had been destroyed at precisely the moment it was needed most. Within the first 24 hours, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were dead. By the end of 1945, the death toll, incorporating those who died from burns, from injuries, and from the effects of radiation, would reach between 90,000 and 166,000. The uncertainty of the numbers is itself a statement about what happened. The destruction was so total that precision becomes impossible. A survivor named Akiko Takakura, who was 300 meters from the hypocenter and somehow lived, later described the first moments. Everything was dark and hot, and she could hear the sounds of people crying all around her, but she could not see them, because her eyes had been blinded temporarily by the light. She could smell burning. She could hear voices asking for water. She could not find where the voices were coming from. Another survivor, Suinao Tsuboi, who was 19 years old, a student, on his way to university, was knocked from his bicycle by the blast and lay on the road as the city burned around him. His skin, he would later say, was hanging from his body like rags. He walked for hours through the ruins, past bodies, past other survivors who were beyond helping. He would survive. He would live to be 96 years old. He would spend the remainder of his life as a peace activist, telling the story of that morning to anyone who would listen, because he believed, with a kind of conviction that only direct witness can produce, that the story must never be allowed to be forgotten. But Hiroshima was not the end. Japan's military leadership learned of the Hiroshima bombing within hours. The first reports from the city were fragmentary, confused, almost incomprehensible. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. This was not a conventional raid. Something fundamentally different had happened. But the response from Tokyo's Supreme War Council was not surrender. It was silence. Deliberation. The same deadlock between the military faction that refused to consider surrender and the civilian faction that believed the war had to end. Emperor Hirohito, who held largely symbolic power within the military government structure, had not yet intervened. In Washington, Truman issued a public statement announcing that the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and warning that if Japan did not surrender, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Japan did not surrender. The second atomic bomb had been scheduled for delivery on August 11th, but weather forecasts showed that a front would move in and ground operations for several days. The mission was moved forward to August 9th. The bomb was different this time. It was a plutonium implosion device, the same design that had been tested at Trinity. It was longer and fatter than Little Boy. It was called Fat Man. It was more powerful, expected to yield the equivalent of roughly 21 kilotons of TNT, the same yield as the Trinity test. The primary target was the city of Kokura. Nagasaki was the backup. The B-29 assigned to drop the bomb was called Boxcar, and it was piloted by Major Charles Sweeney. The mission began badly. A fuel transfer problem meant that roughly 600 gallons of fuel in one tank were inaccessible, which would limit the plane's range. Sweeney could have aborted. He did not. He flew toward Japan. At Yakushima Island, where the planes were scheduled to rendezvous, Boxcar circled for nearly an hour waiting for the third B-29 in the formation, a photography plane that was running late. The circling burned more fuel. Sweeney was already worried about whether he had enough to return to Tinian. He had made arrangements to land at Okinawa, if necessary. They reached Kokura at 9:44 a.m. The city was obscured by haze and industrial smoke. Sweeney made 3 bombing runs over the city. 3 times, the bombardier could not visually acquire the target. Standard operating orders required visual confirmation before release. 3 times, they circled back. Kokura was saved by the smoke above its own steel mills. With fuel running critically low, Sweeney turned toward the secondary target. Nagasaki. Nagasaki was in many ways a different city from Hiroshima. It was older, more architecturally varied, built in the folds of several valleys that ran down to the harbor. It was home to a large Christian community, one of the oldest in Japan, dating to the 16th century. Its Urakami Cathedral was the largest Catholic church in East Asia. The city had been a center of international trade for centuries, and it had a cosmopolitan character that Hiroshima did not. It was also home to the Mitsubishi torpedo and arms manufacturing plants, which made it a legitimate military target in the logic of 1945. At 11:01 a.m. on August 9, 1945, through a gap in the clouds, the only gap available, the only moment of clear visibility, the bombardier on Boxcar released Fat Man. Fat Man detonated at 1,650 feet above the northern part of Nagasaki, approximately 2.5 miles from the intended aiming point. The deviation, caused by the partial cloud cover and the rushed bombing run, meant that the bomb exploded over the Urakami Valley rather than directly over the city center. The surrounding hills partially contained the blast, limiting the destruction compared to what it might have been over a flat city. This was, in the most bitter possible sense, fortunate. It was still incomprehensible. The temperature at the hypocenter reached approximately 3,900 degrees Celsius. Within a second, everything within a half-mile was destroyed or on fire. The Urakami Cathedral, 500 meters from the hypocenter, was demolished instantly. Of the 12,000 Christians in Nagasaki's Urakami community, approximately 8,500 were killed. The city's largest steel plant was obliterated. Residential neighborhoods across the valley were flattened. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people died in the immediate aftermath. By the end of 1945, the death toll reached between 60,000 and 80,000. By the end of 1950, when deaths from radiation-induced cancers and other long-term effects are included, the total death toll from Nagasaki approaches 140,000. A boy named Sumateru Taniguchi was 16 years old on August 9, delivering mail on his bicycle when the bomb detonated. He was 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter. The thermal pulse stripped the skin from his back. He lay in the ruins for 2 days before being found. He spent 3 years and 2 months lying face down in a hospital, because the wounds on his back would not heal if he lay on them. He lived. He became, over the following decades, one of the most prominent voices for nuclear disarmament in the world, a man who showed his scars publicly, because he believed the world needed to see what atomic weapons had done to a 16-year-old boy who had been delivering mail. The scars never fully healed. The memory never did either. Japan's Supreme War Council met in the days following the Nagasaki bombing in a state of extraordinary crisis. The atomic bombings had shattered something, not just cities, but the military leadership's ability to argue that Japan could continue fighting. On August 8, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops. The situation was no longer merely desperate. It was without any rational path forward. And then something happened that had not happened before in modern Japanese history. Emperor Hirohito intervened. In a session on the night of August 9 that ran past midnight, with the Supreme War Council deadlocked, with military leaders still advocating for continued resistance, for a final battle on the home islands, Hirohito spoke. He said that he could not bear to see his people suffer further. He said that continuing the war would result in the complete destruction of the Japanese nation. He said he was prepared to bear the unbearable. The following week was not simple. It was not clean. There was an attempted military coup by junior officers who refused to accept surrender, who physically seized the imperial palace for several hours trying to prevent the broadcast of Hirohito's surrender message from reaching the Japanese people. The coup was suppressed. Several of its leaders committed suicide. On the morning of August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice on the radio. He spoke in formal, archaic language that was difficult even for many Japanese citizens to understand. He did not use the word surrender. He said that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the general trends of the world had all turned against Japan's interest. He spoke of the enemy having begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. He said Japan would endure the unendurable. The war was over. In the United States, people danced in the streets. In Europe, which had already celebrated VE Day in May, the news of Japan's surrender meant the complete end of the most destructive conflict in human history, a conflict that had killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people over 6 years. The celebrations were not wrong. The war had been a catastrophe of civilizational scale, and its ending, by any means, carried genuine relief. But in the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were no celebrations. In the weeks immediately following the bombings, a new kind of death had begun arriving in the ruins. People who had survived the initial blast, who had been far enough from the hypocenter to escape the immediate thermal pulse and the worst of the shockwave, began to die in large numbers. They died in ways that doctors had never seen. They developed purpura, small dark spots under the skin caused by bleeding beneath the surface. Their hair fell out. They bled from their gums, their noses, their eyes. Their white blood cell counts plummeted, destroying their immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to infections their bodies could not fight. Their wounds, which seemed to be healing, suddenly worsened. This was acute radiation syndrome, and in the late summer of 1945, no one in Hiroshima or Nagasaki understood what it was. Japanese doctors, working without most of their equipment, without most of their colleagues, without adequate medicine or food, observed the pattern of symptoms and could not identify its cause. Survivors called it the atomic bomb disease. Some called it the sickness of the bomb. They called it, more simply and more terribly, slow death. The American military initially denied that there was significant residual radiation in the bombed cities. When the Japanese physicist Masao Suzuki submitted a report on radiation sickness to American occupying authorities, they classified it. 4 years after the war, the long-term health effects of the atomic bombs were minimized, controlled, shaped by the political requirements of the emerging Cold War. The Hibakusha, the bomb-affected survivors, found themselves ostracized in Japanese society, feared and stigmatized because their neighbors did not understand radiation, because employers worried about hiring them, because young people worried about marrying them. They had survived the unsurvivable, and in return, they had been made to feel like a living reminder of something Japan preferred not to think about. The Hibakusha lived under that shadow for the rest of their lives. Many lived with chronic illness. Many developed cancer at elevated rates, leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, for decades after the bombings. Their children were studied intensively for genetic effects. The studies, conducted over 50 years, produced complicated, contested results that are still being debated by epidemiologists today. A woman named Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when the bomb fell on Hiroshima. She lived. She grew up near the hypocenter. When she was 11 years old, she developed leukemia. The bomb had been waiting inside her cells for 9 years. She began folding paper cranes in the hospital, inspired by the Japanese legend that anyone who folds 1,000 origami cranes will be granted a wish. She wished to live. She folded over 1,000 cranes before her death in October 1955, at the age of 12. She never completed her wish. She has never been forgotten. The Genbaku Dome, as it came to be called, the skeletal copper dome of the building that stood closest to the hypocenter and survived, barely, as a ruin, was preserved at the insistence of survivors and peace activists who believed the world needed to be able to see what had happened, needed a place where the fact of it could not be denied or softened. Japan's government, in the early post-war years, was not enthusiastic about preservation. The ruins were a source of shame, a reminder of defeat. But the Hibakusha fought for it. In 1996, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the Genbaku Dome and its surrounding park, was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, over the objections of China and the United States, who believed it risked an unbalanced portrayal of the war. That argument, about what the site represents, who it commemorates, and what story it tells, has never fully been resolved. The question of whether the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified has also never been resolved. It is, in some ways, the central unresolved moral question of the 20th century. The arguments on all sides have been made with genuine conviction by serious people, and none of them, even the most persuasive, are able to fully account for all the facts. Those who argue the bombings were justified point to the projected casualty figures for Operation Downfall, the land invasion of Japan, which suggest that the bombs may have saved far more lives than they took. They point to the brutal mathematics of a war that had already killed millions and showed no signs of ending. They note that Japan's military leadership had shown no willingness to surrender despite years of devastating conventional bombing, despite the destruction of its navy, despite the obvious impossibility of victory. They argue that Truman, faced with an obligation to end the war as quickly as possible and to minimize American casualties, made the rational, if terrible, choice available to him. Those who argue the bombings were unjustified point to the civilian populations targeted, cities full of women, children, and elderly men who had no say in their government's military decisions. They argue that the firebombing and naval blockade were already producing conditions in Japan that would have forced surrender within months, and that the bomb was not militarily necessary. They point to the Soviet entry into the war on August 8, which many historians believe may have been more decisive in forcing Japan's surrender than the atomic bombs themselves. They argue that using atomic weapons on cities set a precedent of profound moral and strategic danger, normalizing the targeting of civilian populations with weapons of mass destruction. J. Robert Oppenheimer lived with the bomb for the rest of his life. In October 1945, he resigned as director of Los Alamos and told the Secretary of War that physicists had known sin. He became, in the post-war years, one of the most prominent advocates for international control of atomic weapons and for civilian oversight of nuclear research. He argued against the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon of far greater destructive power. In 1954, during the McCarthy era, his security clearance was revoked following a hearing that most historians now regard as politically motivated and professionally dishonest. He was effectively destroyed as a public figure. He died of throat cancer in 1967, at 62. In 2022, the U.S. government vacated the findings of the 1954 security hearing and restored his name. It was 68 years late. Harry Truman never publicly expressed regret for the decision to use the atomic bombs. In his memoirs and in later interviews, he consistently defended the decision on the grounds that it ended the war and saved lives. He said he lost no sleep over it. Whether this was entirely true, or whether it was the kind of psychological fortification that an old politician constructs around a decision that cannot be undone, is not knowable. Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, also expressed no regret. He flew the mission he was ordered to fly. He said repeatedly, in the decades after the war, that he would do it again under the same circumstances, that it was a military mission, and he was a military man, and that the morality of the weapon was not his to decide. He requested that there be no funeral service and no grave marker after his death, because he did not want his burial site to become a place of protest. He died in 2007. There was no funeral. There is no grave marker. The atomic age that began over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 did not end with Japan's surrender. It accelerated. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949. By 1952, the United States had detonated a hydrogen bomb with a yield more than 450 times that of Little Boy. By the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union together held enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization many times over. The concept of mutually assured destruction, the doctrine that neither side would launch a nuclear first strike because the retaliation would be equally catastrophic, became the foundation of superpower strategy. It was a peace built on the promise of mutual annihilation. It was the most stable and the most fragile peace in human history. It held. It has held. So far. Today, Hiroshima is a city of over 1 million people. It is rebuilt. It is prosperous. Its rivers run clear in the summer, and its famous cherry trees bloom each spring around the Peace Memorial Park. Tourists come from around the world to visit the park, to walk through the Peace Memorial Museum, to read the testimonies of the hibakusha in English and Japanese and French and Chinese. Each year on August 6th, the city holds a ceremony at which the names of new victims are added to the memorial registry, because people are still dying, even now, of radiation-related cancers that can be traced to the bomb that fell on them when they were young. The list grows every year. Nagasaki holds its own ceremony on August 9th. The Urakami Cathedral was rebuilt. It stands today over the valley where 8,500 of its congregation were killed in a single second. The bells ring each year at 11:02 a.m., the corrected time of the detonation, adjusted from the original report, and for a moment, the city goes quiet. There are currently an estimated 12,500 nuclear warheads in the world's arsenals. The United States holds approximately 5,550. Russia holds approximately 6,257. Together, these two nations own more than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea hold the rest. Each of these weapons is, at minimum, many times more powerful than the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some are hundreds of times more powerful. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated, the Soviet Tsar Bomba, tested in 1961, yielded the equivalent of 50 megatons of TNT. Little Boy yielded 15 kilotons. The Tsar Bomba was 3,333 times more powerful. These weapons exist. They are maintained. They are pointed, in various configurations and readiness states, at cities around the world where people are doing, on this very morning, what the people of Hiroshima were doing on the morning of August 6, 1945. They are making breakfast. They are braiding their daughter's hair. They are delivering mail on bicycles. They are going to school and to work and to the market and to the river's edge to watch the light change on the water. None of them know what is coming. We do. It is still burning.